Hello there, Christopher here. A quick special request before we dive into this episode. We've been producing the Musicality podcast for about 6 months now, and I really want to know, what have been your favourite episodes? If you've been listening since the beginning, then a big thank you to you. And you'll know that we've had a real variety of guests on the show, and topics too. To help us make sure that the show is as useful and enjoyable as possible for you in future, I want to hear from you, our listeners, about what's been the best so far. To share your favourite, what I'd like you to do is please post a review of the podcast. You'll find easy instructions at musicalitypodcast.com/review. And I'd love for you to write anything you like about the show in general, and then pick out one favourite episode and share what made that one top of the list for you. A big thank you in advance for taking just a few minutes to do this, especially if you don't think of yourself as someone who normally writes reviews or posts things online. It means a huge amount to us here on the team when we see a new review come in, and it really helps the show to reach more people like you. And of course, it'll help us plan better and better episodes for you in the future. Thanks again, and I look forward to hearing about your favorites so far.
Hi, this is Chris Owenby from practicehabits.co, and you're listening to the Musicality Podcast.
Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, founder of Musical You, and welcome to the Musicality Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Chris Owenby, the man behind the website Practice Habits, where he shares blog posts and videos to help musicians, and especially piano teachers, with their students to form more effective and enjoyable practice routines in music. As well as running Practice Habits and the corresponding members website for piano teachers, Chris is also an award-winning composer and the creator of the online piano course, which, as you'll be hearing in this episode, is an interestingly different approach to learning piano, both in what it covers and the way it is taught online. In this conversation, we talk about the unusual musical journey that led to Chris being equally comfortable in the worlds of sheet music and playing by ear. We talk about how to find patterns in the music you play and why that's useful. And we talk about the clever way Chris has managed to reconcile the importance of adapting teaching to fit each student with providing an online course for learning piano. I expected to focus mostly on practice tips and tricks in this interview, but it turned out to be so rich in interesting ideas and advice about playing by ear, improvising, and finding your own way through music learning that I think we're going to have to invite Chris back for a part 2 in future. My name is Christopher Sutton, and this is the Musicality Podcast from Musical You. Welcome to the show, Chris. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Christopher. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
So I've so enjoyed diving into your website and learning all about your teaching at Practice Habits for piano teachers and also your online course for piano students. But I'd love to know more about Chris Owenby himself. Can you tell us, how did your musical story begin?
Sure. So I have a unique upbringing in the fact that I was born and raised in the church. In fact, my family was the leadership of the church. So my grandpa was the pastor, my grandmother, the church pianist, my dad, the music director, and my mom did some of the children's music there. And, being around music at such an early age was, I guess, unique in a lot of ways, but definitely helped me kind of fall into music. It was just, I was around it. I was going to rehearsals. I got to see my dad lead the music on Sunday mornings and be a part of that. And it's funny, I even remember certain melodies and from songs that I would have sung in some of the children's musicals there. So I was around that my childhood, and that church still exists today, and my grandma's still playing in the church. But I began taking piano lessons at age 6. And so I did the whole classical thing, or I'd go and learn basic technique, learn how to read music. But I was a horrible student, didn't really practice that much. Took classical piano lessons for the majority of, being in a child in elementary, middle school, and then in high school as well. I took a couple of years off in there. But for sure, I was around music from just an early age.
And so tell me what that looked like for you when you say you were involved in the music in the church. Was that mostly singing?
In the beginning, mostly singing, because I would have been a part of the children's musicals and plays there, which my mom would have led. And then just really as a spectator, I guess. I say spectator, but in worship, watching the worship band, my dad leading the music, grandma playing, but primarily as a singer, for sure. It's funny. I joke with some of my students today. I teach piano, but I joke with some of my students talking about ear training and such, that I grew up in the church singing the hymns and singing the songs, but I rarely sang the melody because my mom, we'd stand together in the congregation and she would always sing the alto harmony. So I would learn the alto harmony, and that was just part of my church musical experience. So for sure singing and singing the melodies, and then, with my mom singing some alto.
Fantastic. I love that as a route into singing harmony at such an early age. That's great. And so when you were taking those piano lessons, then what kind of piano teaching was that? What style, or was it very traditional or more creative?
It was very traditional. And just fun fact for you, my piano teacher was also my mother's piano teacher, as well as my aunt's piano teacher, Miss Jackie Hudson, who I got to see just a couple of weeks ago. Very traditional teacher. We did the method books and all of that. So from beginning and all the way up to level 7, level 8, whatever they go up to. So that was a very traditional approach with some supplemental material, especially as I got older, playing some of the classical pieces and such.
And how did you find that? Was that a factor in you being a poor student and not practicing, or was it appealing and you didn't practice for other reasons?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to play outside, really. And I wanted to do other things, right? For sure, my parents would, I guess, make me practice or encourage me to practice, sometimes strongly encourage me to practice. Otherwise, I wouldn't get my dessert or something. But I say I was a poor student in the fact that I guess my practice wasn't focused. But at the same time, I really didn't know my practice should be focused. As great of a piano teacher as I had, I'm not so sure, and she probably did, and I just wasn't paying attention. I'm not so sure we talked about the power of focus in practice. And when you're a child learning how to play the instrument, there's a lot on your mind anyway. There's you're thinking about a lot of different things, and not so much in a strategic way when you're in your piano lessons and your practice. So that's something that has to be learned, I think. But for sure, as I got older, could have spent some more time on the piano. I knew I should. And I guess at some point I realized that my practice should be somewhat focused. But, I think some of that just comes with age, maturity, and being exposed to different things, right?
Mm. Interesting. I asked for a couple of reasons. I think the first is just that I always love to pick our guests' brains and backstory to find out, were they the kid who was glued to the piano and couldn't be pulled away from it? Or were they more like, I'm sure a lot of our listeners can identify with, that it didn't come that naturally and it wasn't always that much fun to practice? And certainly for me growing up, I was very lucky in the music education I had early on, but I was not, I was not a diligent practicer by any stretch. And the second reason I ask is just that obviously you are known now for practice habits, where you have some fantastic advice. And I'm going to be picking your brains later in the conversation for some tips for our listeners on better practicing and maybe what teachers can do to help their students stay motivated with that practice. So I think it's interesting to hear that you were one who was not finding it so motivating in your early years.
It's kind of ironic and funny and strange all at the same time, right? But
yeah, ironic or poetic.
Yeah,
I think that you've come full circle.
So there were for sure pieces along the way that maybe were pieces that I could resonate with a bit more. I think for me in the beginning, just because classical repertoire presents its own set of challenges. All different styles do, but it was very difficult for me to focus on certain pieces. I enjoyed certain styles. As I said, I was born and raised around music in the church, so those. I was used to a certain style of music, and for sure we did kind of old timey Southern gospel stuff, but then that eased into modern day kind of praise and worship stuff, which is very pop syncopated rhythms. And so when I was presented with a pop piece that I could play, something in that style, in that vein, I really gravitated toward that, and could spend more time practicing that because I was interested. And kind of shied away from some of the classics that I kind of grew to love. So
cool. So maybe that leads on to the answer to what I wanted to ask you next, which is, how did you go from that slightly inauspicious beginning of reluctant piano student to becoming a piano teacher and someone who is clearly very enthusiastic about the art of teaching and the art of learning?
Sure.
What changed along the way?
Right. So, doing classical piano lessons, and love my teacher, as I said, not the greatest student. But just one day, my grandmother, as I said, she was the church pianist in our home church, who was just, and still to this day, fantastic gospel pianist. Like, you talk about the stride style of piano, where you take that left hand from the bass notes all the way up to the chords. Just a very difficult style of playing, and then maintaining the melody and these intricate kind of harmonies in the right hand. Just very difficult. And, I play at a stride style. I'm not very good at it. But, she said, "Christopher, come on over to the piano." And, I knew it was serious. You're Christopher, but my family calls me Chris. So if they call me Christopher, it's a serious thing. So she called me over to the piano. We were going to have a piano lesson, and this was going to be a non-traditional piano lesson. Now, my grandma kind of read music, but I think it had probably been years since she pulled out a piece, so she would have been very rusty. And I think at some point we had that conversation. But she brought me over, and she began playing this old-timey gospel song. I guess if I could remember, it's I can't remember the title, but if I were to hear it, I'd know it immediately. But she began to play this piece, and just the intricate harmonies she would come up with, they were really beautiful to me. And I had grown up with that style, so listening to that, it felt good to hear her play it, to see her play it. And then she began to kind of place my hands on the piano and say, here's this harmony. This is where you should place your hand. It looks and sounds like this. And so I began to kind of mimic what she was doing on the piano. She wasn't giving me a whole lot of background in terms of this is why you're doing that, but I think she just wanted me to hear me play that piece, like she was playing that piece. And this will point to the fact that my grandma, being just a wonderful musician and just a wonderful person, not that wonderful of a teacher. She would get really frustrated at me. You can't hear that? You can't hear that right there? This chord right here, this one right here. And she'd play it over and over and over again. Say, no, I can't hear that when I call her Mimi. I can't hear that, Mimi. And, from that moment, though, I think I got towards the end of the lesson and could play maybe a chorus of it, just muscle memory, remembering exactly where she had placed my hands on the piano. And so 2 or 3 lessons of that, and finally learning that song, Holy Ground, I believe is the name of the song. And, after 3 lessons of that, and then being able to play that song from start to finish, I think at this point I was 13 or so, 12 or 13, 14 years old. And being able to play that from start to finish without sheet music, and it sound like my grandma playing it, even though I had no clue what I was doing, just kind of the muscle memory, felt really good. And it was music I was familiar with. It sounded musical because she had taught me some of the expression and all of that. And that from that moment on, I began to dive deep into learning how to play pieces in that same way by listening and then mimicking or playing back what I had learned from the CD. So I vivaciously, would just grab CDs, put them in the CD player, listen to the piano part. And now, instead of actually physically, YouTube wasn't here yet with all the all the videos and stuff that, I could mimic the parts, but I would listen back, and this is her instruction to me. I would listen back to those CDs and pick those parts out as best I could. I mean, you talk about repetition. And, I couldn't do it with the classical pieces, although the repetition would have helped, I knew how to play the notes on the page, but just something about hearing that music and being able to play it back just really inspired me. So I began to learn songs in that way. And that I feel is the moment that I really began to fall in love with music and music making.
That's wonderful. I think that kind of learning by ear and really just focusing on the sound and your instrument, it gives you such a different dimension on learning music, doesn't it? It gives you such a different relationship with your instrument. I remember when we had Sarah Campbell on the show previously, she was talking about some of the ways she helped her students to understand scales based on the finger shapes and the visual of the piano keyboard rather than just the dots on the staff. And it's that same thing where, your brain just kind of opens up and you realize, oh, there's this whole other way to think about music. Right.
It's, improvisation, to be able to hear something, a song that you love, and be able to play it back, and even if you're reading sheet music, it's the same way. And I grew to love that, learned to love that. And that's kind of the second part of my story, I guess. But being able to hear something and play it back, that was for sure for me the key to falling in love with music and music making. So,
and it's really cool to hear too that for you it was kind of painstaking repetition. The way we teach it playing by ear at Musical U, we don't promise it's kind of a magical switch that you can flip and, the trick of playing by ear, or you don't have to have a gift. It really is about trial and error, and it's about experimentation. Right. And yes, there's ear training and specific exercises you can do to accelerate that. But reality is someone who plays by ear has practiced playing by ear, and practicing means you're going to get it wrong some of the time. So I think you painted a really vivid picture there of you listening to the CDs and just trying and finding your way to being able to play by ear.
That's the right word, painful at times. It really is. But, through that pain, there's great reward on the other end. And when you learn a piece, you learn a lick or whatever, it's very encouraging. So.
And of course, there can be more structured and more efficient ways to do it, as we'll be talking about later in the context of your online piano course. But first, I want to find out where that journey went. So you had this whole new dimension opened up to you in terms of learning by ear and improvising and arranging by ear. Where did things go from there?
So improvisation kind of became the catalyst for getting interested in learning how to write my own songs and compose. In the beginning, for me, it would have just, the word composition wouldn't have come to mind, although I certainly knew what it meant. It would have been songwriting, because I grew up in the church. And what do we sing in church? In the old country church, we sing songs. We're not singing pieces. We're not, hearing traditional preludes and postludes as much as I love them in traditional worship. For me, it was songs. So that led to just this idea of learning how to write my own music. And, I around this time, 13, 14 years old, I began to get interested in the possibility of playing with my church band. So, being in a small church and a family kind of in leadership like that, and grew up in the church and being a part of those things for sure, and having at this point the musical technique to get involved and contribute to the church band, they were happy to let me be a part of that. So that, I tell you, was a huge learning experience for me, and what a great opportunity to be able to play now with seasoned musicians. And for our little church, we had a good little band. So my grandma, as I said, on keys, and we had guitar, bass, and the drummer that came in and out, maybe a drummer that would rotate in and out from time to time. But being able to now put these new ideas and concepts into practice was really beneficial. So I began to learn how to read chords on a chord chart. how to be able to look at a lead sheet, look at the melodic line, which I knew how to read because I'd taken the classical lessons, but now make sense of it in terms of that is a melody, and I'm going to harmonize it with chords and make it sound more full and complete, make it sound like music. So that was a great learning experience for me, getting to play with that band. So I played all the way up to going off to college, and I went to a small college out in LaGrange, Georgia, and got involved immediately with the music program there. At this point, I'd taken a couple years off classical piano lessons, which I think was good for me at the time because it allowed me to focus on improvisation and putting those ideas into practice. And being able to visualize music from this other side was really helpful and would be really helpful in learning how to write my own songs. So I'd written some songs up until this point, applied to the music program at LaGrange College, got accepted to the music composition program, but then also wanted to keep up with my piano. So, at this point, I can't say that I had fallen in love with traditional classical piano yet. I for sure appreciated it because I knew how much work and effort went into it. But I wanted to try my hand at jazz. So I took some jazz piano lessons, had a fantastic teacher. I'll go ahead and tell you, I skimmed the surface of jazz. Like I could play a little jazz for you now. But those 2 years taking jazz lessons just kind of helped me flesh out these ideas, learning how to improvise, learning how to play with lead sheets and improvise around chords, and also play with a band in a different style. The way you approach music theory in a jazz context is very different from a classical context. Some of the chords that you voice are very different from classical voicings, and just the way, even though they're the same nuts and bolts in a lot of ways, the way you play in a jazz setting is very different from a classical setting. So it was really helpful for me to take those couple of years of jazz piano lessons, but then eventually. I saw the importance, especially as I began to, like, my songwriting was now becoming more, I was getting more interested in music composition in the traditional sense, fell in love with choral music, fell in love with, started listening to a lot of Bach at this time. And that's interesting too, right? Because Bach and jazz, there's a lot of similarities there between Baroque period music and the way jazz sounds. I think that's really interesting. Just the similarities between those two. And there's been a lot of artists that take, right, those Baroque pieces and jazzify them and put them in that style. It's kind of a neat thing. But I began to get interested in composition in the traditional sense, notating my creations or whatever I was working on. And that led me back to classical piano lessons. Now, I hated myself for taking those 2 years off because now I had to get back into reading music. And if you've ever taken some time off, and I left off as in high school, being able to read some like legit pieces. I could play some Beethoven sonatas and such. I can't say that I played them extremely well, but I knew how to read through them. And I got back into classical lessons in college, and it was painful to kind of work back up to where I had left off. But eventually did it. It didn't take 2 years to get there. It took a few months of lots of practice and focused practice. There's that word again. But I eventually got there and fell in love with classical piano.
Interesting. That's pretty rare in my experience. Someone who starts out in the sheet music world, as it were, takes a trip into the world of playing by ear and improvisation and the more jazzy style of things, and then circles back and kind of rekindles their love of the classical style.
Yeah, for me, it was music composition for sure. Being is kind of what brought that full circle. Because at this point, I realized music, regardless of the style, whether it's classical, whether it's traditional classical or improvisation, pop, jazz, whatever, music is music. The nuts and bolts of music theory, chords, scales, but it's the way we approach these things that determine the style of music and inform that style of music. The way we play certain things in a classical setting might be very different than we play them in a jazz or improvisatory way, but at the end of the day, they're all the same thing. So I was surrounded by folks who were doing both. So I had friends that were writing songs and recording, producing their songs in the studio there at the college. And then I had friends who were notating pieces for choir and getting them performed by the choir. And I wanted to be able to do that as well. So I saw at this point, for Chris and his musical future, I had to make a decision. Was I going to embrace one style and kind of focus on that? I've always been that way. I either pick this track and kind of go with it, pick this track and go with that. Or was I going to be able to take both of those styles and kind of merge them into what I did, let that inform my musical direction. So I chose to now learn how to begin notating my compositions, also for playback, right? For the way a composer is heard and appreciated is through the conduit of other musicians. So as a composer, I realized I could put a lead sheet in front of somebody and ask them to improvise one of my songs, which would be fine, and I'd be happy to hear that. But at the same time, if I ever wanted someone to hear a vocal piece of mine or something like this, it was going to have to be notated. So I needed to learn how to notate what was the stuff that I was coming up with. So that's kind of that idea of bridging those two styles, and then through my music composition, being able to be heard in different ways is what I think helped me bring me full circle back to the classical piano lessons.
And that certainly seems to have paid off for you in a very successful career as a composer. It's also something that comes through very clearly, I think, in practicehabits.co and the way you approach teaching piano, that you do kind of bridge those two worlds of the sheet music, classical, and the free, creative, ear-based side of things. I'd love to hear more about how you approach that. Maybe we could take the example of how you begin lessons with a new student, or how you structure things over time to kind of give them a taste of both of those worlds and help them feel comfortable in both.
Sure. So I guess I'm not traditional in the sense that when I have a new student come into my studio, that we immediately dive into the method books and kind of stay there, learning how to play the notes on the page based on fingerings and just teaching them traditional notation. I for sure teach them traditional notation, but I'm also, as I've already mentioned, I think it's important to be a well-rounded musician to have the ability to both read and then also learn how to take those elements and learn how to improvise and play things from ear. So for me to say that I adopt one approach for every student would not be the case. So I will analyze kind of first and foremost, every student's different, right? So when they come in, some of them may be more inclined to read the notes on the page and do really, really well there. But then some come in and you notice 3 or 4 or 5 lessons in, they're reading the notes, but if you take the book away and teach them the patterns of whatever piece they're working on, method piece, it's much easier for them to grasp onto the pattern without the notated music in front of them, as opposed to actually looking at the page and playing the notes on the page. So every student learns differently. So I think it's being sensitive to the different ways that kids learn. I say kids, most of my students are kids. I teach a couple of adults as well. But even then, the whatever the experience is of that adult coming in, whether they're a brand new student or whether they've had classical lessons in the past or approached from a sheer kind of improvisatory approach to piano, that kind of informs the direction of those piano lessons. So I think it's just being sensitive to those things. But yeah, if a student comes in, I'm going to try to adapt my approach to fit however it's seeming that student is going to learn best. And for sure, if we stick with those books for a little while, at some point, I'm going to teach them how to take those same ideas and concepts, chords, scales, and learn how to improvise. I just had a student come in today, and she's great at reading the printed page and just can add the expression once she's learned the notes. She's just got a knack for it. One thing that we have started focusing on a lot more recently is taking scales and chords and putting those into practice. So we're taking a simple song, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and she learned that in the key of C. If you're familiar with a piano, the key of C is all the white notes from C to shining C, as I like to say. And she places her hands on the right note. I show her finger position, and then using her ear, and this was all her, I said, I want you to pick out the song Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And, I'd ask her questions about the melody. At this point, the first note to the second note, twinkle, twinkle, does that leap or does that step? Do you feel like there's a gap between those notes or not? And of course, she answers back, there's a gap between those notes. So that informs kind of the direction that she's going to go when she places her hands on the piano. So, getting her then to transpose that to different places on the piano. So there's very much an element of using the ear and improvisation in my approach to teaching, as well as notated music.
And it's interesting there that in that example, you were giving her a bit of a framework to work with. When we did our improv month here on the podcast, we were talking a bit about this idea of playgrounds, where to improvise or to learn to improvise in a safe and relaxed way, it can be helpful to set some boundaries and say, okay, I'm just going to work with this scale, or I'm going to use this chord progression, so that roughly speaking, what you're going to play is going to sound musical. It sounds like you're using those same kinds of concepts.
Definitely. I think a framework is good. Like I like having guidelines and boundaries as well, right? And whether it's a piece I'm working on, learning how to play, focusing on a particular passage and walking away with having accomplished one or two things, or whether it's something that I'm composing. If it's a choral piece, the text is what kind of dictates the piece and where I choose to go with the music. So framework is good. It's great for little musicians. It's great for older musicians.
And you used another word that I love in the context of playing by ear and improvising, which is patterns. You said, if a student is working with the sheet music, but you notice that it's more helpful to take that away and show them some of the underlying patterns, that can be helpful. Can you explain a bit more what you mean by that, and maybe some examples of patterns you would draw out from a particular piece to equip the student with? Sure.
So music is all about patterns. I mean, if you look at a piece of music that's well crafted, typically you'll find that an 8-bar phrase, 8-measure phrase is made up of maybe 4 melodic patterns or 2 larger melodic patterns. So it's very symmetrical. Take Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, bum, 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 and then throughout the entire first movement there, you get nothing but this pattern over and over again. So patterns are important. And to teach students where those patterns are in the music is also very important. So we might take a piece right before the student's even playing it, or maybe, I typically like to sight read, have the student sight read through a brand new piece with me in the room, so that I can point out certain things that's going to help them and inform their practice at home. So we might take a simple piece. For this example, let's take Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. If that's notated on the page, or if it's not notated on the page, in the same way I did it with Ava, I can still point out those patterns. So say it's notated, we'd look at the patterns together, being able to visualize those patterns, and then I'd have the student slowly. That's another thing. Slow and steady kind of wins the race, especially when we're learning a brand new piece of music. But I'd have the student slowly play through a passage, and then along the way, I'd point out certain patterns. So twinkle, twinkle, little star, da, da, dee, da, dee, da, da. There's the first pattern. or the first melodic snippet, and then we hear the second rhythmic pattern, dot, 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 dee, dot, dot, same exact rhythm. So I'd point that out to the student. So that's one example of, finding those patterns within pieces of music. Another book that's just chock full of patterns is a scale book. It teaches lots of exercises for us pianists, Hannon. And Hannon just has all kinds of exercises. And so that would be, you could teach Hannon exercises to classical or to classical students, or to folks who are just wanting to learn how to improvise. It's great to teach finger dexterity, but then also it's chock full of patterns. So you can simply show a student maybe the first pattern. I'll try to hum one for you from, I think, the first exercise, la da dee 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 da. And so stepwise motion, moving up the keys, you play that pattern over and over and over again. So it's locking into the patterns and then helping students see those patterns, and then that's going to help inform their practice at home.
That's great. I'm really reminded of an episode we did with Nick Manella of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast, where he was talking about learning vocabulary for becoming a jazz improviser. But the crucial thing he was saying was to not just learn it by rote, but to take the time to analyze it, figure out what's going on, and really get into it conceptually. And I love that you're describing the same kind of thing for sheet music. It's not just, can you learn to play the right notes at the right time with your fingering? It's really, let's pick this apart, figure out what was the composer doing, how does it all fit together, and then what can we take away and use in a different context?
Sure. And, even back to the music composition thing, it's the same way. I mean, when you're learning to compose, the best way to do that is grab a score and look at the patterns within a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart symphony or something like this. I know you have a lot of bass players and guitarists in your audience as well. That would be a great exercise for someone who's wanting to learn how to play the bass, right? To take a specific pattern, bass lick, and play that through a set of chords, a chord progression, and just changing the position. Maybe the groove is set up to sound something like la da dee da 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 dee da, and then just taking that idea, transposing it up a note to different chords is a great exercise for any musician. But there you go, free one for the bass players.
Nice. And so that maybe gets a bit at a question I had in my head hearing you talk through that and, kind of scanning the sheet music, looking for these patterns. Do you think that's something students can do independently, or do you think it takes a teacher to guide them through and find those patterns?
That's interesting you asked that question. And very recently I had a student come to me. Thomas is his name, and I tell you, out of a lot of students that I've taught a lot of kids how to play the piano. Thomas has more of a natural knack ability for finding those patterns. He's really good at math, I have found, talking to his mom. So for Thomas, I didn't have to really teach him where the patterns are. He kind of finds those on his own. I think it depends. Certain students are going to be a little more naturally inclined to gravitate, to find those things and gravitate towards those things in the music, whereas others might need a little bit of direction in the beginning. I probably fell into the second camp as a kid. Show me where the patterns are, give me a template to work with, and then I can go home and do that. So I think for most students, giving them that instruction in the one-on-one lesson, and then allowing them to take that home and practice through that and find those patterns, for me would be kind of the most common approach. But then you're going to run across students like Thomas who just have a natural ability to find those patterns and make sense of them. He's funny. He brought a piece to me the other day and showed me where the patterns were, and I hadn't really thought through. I was like, "Oh, you're right, Thomas. Oh, I never thought about that one." So, there you go.
I think it's such a fascinating area. It relates, I think, a lot to something we talk about in Musical You, which is passive ear training. You know, the idea that apart from doing active exercises to develop your ears, you can also learn a lot just by listening to music, and particularly if you're paying attention to the music. But what we find is a lot of our members coming in, they often have a lot of musical experience, but they don't have any of the mental frameworks for making sense of it. So their ears are picking up on these patterns, and as a listener, they're appreciating them, but it needs for them to be shown, you know, these are the structures you're hearing, and these are the names for them, before they can really get a handle on it and start spotting them. And the good news is, often they can make very rapid progress with a few little pointers like that. And I think that's definitely one of the benefits of a one-on-one lesson, like you describe, is your teacher can just kind of hand you those names and structures and explanations of what the student is naturally interested in listening to in the music.
Sure. As I said earlier, every student, old or young, is different, and they're going to learn differently. So, just being sensitive to that and embracing that, even for the student to embrace that. That's the way I learn. Like, that's okay. And, taking it and running with it. I'm with you. Patterns are important.
So to play devil's advocate a little bit, you, as someone who recognizes that each student is different and they're coming to it with a different learning style maybe, or a different musical background, how have you found it developing an online course that students can use, and how does that work in the online piano course?
Sure. So the online piano course is essentially more of an improvisatory approach to learning how to play the piano, where I can take students through kind of the nuts and bolts, scales, chords, and crafting those things, reproducing those things on the piano to learn how to play their favorite songs. And what I found is that being, first off, very, very clear with folks that are signing up for the course, that this is a course where I'm going to be teaching you essentially how to learn how to improvise is helpful. In the course itself, when crafting it in the beginning, I was a little skeptical of how the whole thing was going to work. I knew there were Skype lessons, but even on like an individual Skype lesson, just like right now, you and I can see one another. You can see the piano student. You can demonstrate for the piano student. So how do you do that with a group of people? How do you explain things? Of course, you can do this through pre-recorded video, which is very much a part of the course, and probably where most of the music fundamentals are taught in the online piano course is just through those pre-recorded videos. But I wanted there to be some kind of live community feel to it as well. And I've gotten really interested in Facebook Live as of late, and thinking of that being kind of almost a natural teaching tool for that, especially for groups. So it's worked beautifully inside the course. In addition to the pre-recorded content, I'm teaching folks how to improvise using scales and chords, but also kind of being their virtual coach in the Facebook Live videos. So it gives us that almost one-on-one kind of a feel where I'm able to demonstrate things. And if they have a question about something, they can type that in the comment section, right?
It's definitely a core part of our philosophy at Musical You that you can't design an effective one-size-fits-all music course in general. Definitely not for the more creative skills of musicality, like improvisation and the whole ear training side of things. We've just found, because musicians are so different, if you try and put everyone on the same path, it doesn't work for anybody. And so I was just really interested to hear how it's been going, providing, nominally a course with your clear understanding that every student is different. And it sounds like you found a really elegant solution to that, to combine the pre-recorded material with a very personal support aspect through the Facebook Live.
Yeah, it's working really well. And like I said in the beginning, it took a lot of thought to kind of think through how, as you say, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this thing. And being someone who has taught traditional piano lessons one-on-one, I wanted to bring that one-on-one feel to an online group lesson format. And so the Facebook live videos and those Q&A sessions together have been really, really helpful. So I get a lot of good feedback from the members, many of who are learning how to play the piano for the first time, and many who are just wanting to take their basic piano knowledge to the next level. So it's fun. It's a lively group of folks that just want to learn how to play the piano, and they're finally learning. So it's good.
Fantastic. And give us a little glimpse of what's covered in that course. You said it's focused on the improvisational side of things. How do you teach that?
Sure. So teaching students basic scales, such as the C major scale that I mentioned earlier, as well as scales that are related to major scales, the minor scales. Every major scale has a related minor scale. So learning major and minor scales, which make up the basically the foundation of Western music as we know it, major and minor, that happier sound versus that sadder sound that you hear. Teaching students how to play with those scales, to play them. Here's the funny part. Even though we're improvising, I'm still teaching classical technique because some stuff just works. You play a scale, there should be a certain fingering, right? So I teach them kind of the proper way to play these scales, the way that makes most sense, and then to how to take those scales and take the chords, clusters of notes, right, stacked up together, and then use those ideas to play their favorite songs, music that they're interested in learning how to play. So some of the pre-recorded video, it takes students all the way to the beginning, like basic scales, and then learning the basic chords, your primary chords, and then how to apply that to the songs that they want to learn, but then also how to take that a step further and transpose their songs to different keys on the piano. And then within the live piano lessons, we're building upon those concepts taught in the pre-recorded lessons, answering any questions that they have, and just building a firm foundation for piano students. I've laid the framework already for basic scales and chords, and now we just kind of build upon that. So.
Well, I think any listeners who are following along with our Improv Month will appreciate how much I believe, and at Musical U, we believe in that kind of scales and chords approach to really kind of equip you with the building blocks that music is made from. It's not about randomly picking notes from the air and trusting your instinct. It's about really understanding, where the notes in music come from.
And I think that's the important thing, because, and don't get me wrong, because I said, at the beginning of our conversation, with my grandma teaching me how to play that song visually through muscle memory, that was important. And that kind of set me on this path to really understand what was happening there and learn how to play songs from or by ear. But we do live in this age where you can just hop on the internet, right, and pull up a song. And there's so many folks that teach, and I think it's a beautiful thing. But at the same time, having this kind of more of a traditional approach to teaching in general, even if I'm teaching students how to play something by ear, I think you hit on it there, that it's important to show students why they're doing what they're doing, why it works. Because if they understand how and why it works, then they can reproduce that on different songs that they want to learn, or maybe simply transposing a song to a different key, So it's important to learn also the why and the how.
That sounds like a really terrific way to teach improvisation. So definitely for any listeners who are looking to bring their piano skills to improvisation, or who are maybe just looking to get started on piano in a free and creative way, definitely do check out the online piano course, and you'll find that at expeditionpiano.com. Chris, is there anything on that site that people can get started with if they want a taste of how this could work for them?
Sure. So if folks go to www.expeditionpiano.com/free piano course, that's going to take them to a sign up page where they can sign up for a free course where I'm basically going to teach folks the nuts and bolts, those chords, those scales, to get started playing their favorite songs. And if anyone, wants a little more one-on-one approach and access to those Facebook live videos as well, then they could definitely sign up to the online piano course. And that's something I'd be happy to to share with folks.
Tremendous. Thank you. Well, we'll definitely put a link to both of those in the show notes for this episode at musicalitypodcast.com. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I wanted to dig into practice habits with you, and I think we'll link in the show notes to a blog post you have on your recommended habits to make for effective practice, because it's definitely something that any listeners can really benefit from to really maximize the results they get from their practice sessions. But I should let you go, and thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you, Chris, and learn more about your own background and your approach to teaching.
It's been a pleasure, Christopher. So thank you so much for having me, and keep up the good work.
The Musicality Podcast is brought to you by Musical You. Learn more at musical-u.com.
Chris has had such an interesting musical journey, and I loved hearing about how he's drawn from that in developing his teaching, both in person and online. Let's run through all the interesting points from that conversation. Chris grew up immersed in music at his family's church, singing and just enjoying the music making going on around him. He started taking piano lessons, which followed quite a traditional method, focused on sheet music and classical repertoire. He found he wasn't very motivated to practice, and although he continued with lessons into his teenage years, it wasn't until an impromptu lesson with his grandmother that he really connected with the piano in an enthusiastic way. Chris's grandmother showed him how to play a style of music he loved, and learn it by ear and through muscle memory, getting him completely away from the sheet music he was used to. And he continued to explore this dimension onto music learning, devouring all the worship CDs in the house and painstakingly figuring out how to play them himself by ear. Chris went on to study composition at university, and this led to him thinking about notation again, and he found a new love for the classical music he had started with. Although he was rusty, he got back up to speed with classical piano, and this blend of the sheet music world and the by-ear world had a big positive impact on his success as a composer and his remarkable style of teaching, both in person and online. I loved having the chance to dig into this a bit with Chris and find out how he helps his students to feel comfortable in those two quite different worlds of music making. He noted that every student is different, and first and foremost, he tries to be sensitive to that and adapt to what kinds of learning they respond best to. This might mean focusing on sheet music for one, but another might do better when the underlying patterns in the sheet music are pointed out, and he shows them how to play the music by ear using those patterns as their building blocks. We talked about the usefulness of scales and the primary chords, meaning the 1, 4, 5, and 6 chords, which we've discussed often here on the Musicality podcast. We talked about how improvising and playing by ear doesn't mean plucking notes from the air at random or on pure instinct, but both are learnable skills which require practice and repetition, but which can be accelerated through getting to know these frameworks and common patterns of music. Something else which has come up often here on the podcast before is the challenge of being a self-directed learner online, with the vast array of tutorials and learning resources available, and the prevalence of one-size-fits-all courses that often end up fitting nobody quite right. I think it's fascinating how Chris has combined the convenience and affordability of pre-made online video tutorials with the personal support and guidance that can be provided by live video group coaching sessions. I think that's a really elegant approach that no doubt works great for his students at the online piano course. If you're interested to learn to improvise on piano or keyboard, whether you've learned some piano before or not, definitely do check out expeditionpiano.com, where you'll find that course, and also the link we'll put in the show notes to the free mini-course Chris is offering to help you get started. And if you're a music teacher or just interested in improving the results you get from your music practice, you'll really enjoy exploring practicehabits.co, where Chris has posted articles and video tutorials galore. I'd particularly recommend his blog post entitled 5 Brilliant Practice Habits, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode at musicalitypodcast.com. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Stay tuned for our next one, where we'll be talking about the trial and error approach to learning to play by ear.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners.